Welcome back to the LNS Exchange, a podcast about teaching and learning in the College of Letters and Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today's episode continues a series of conversations with this year's Distinguished Teaching Award winners. 8 of the 13 honorees represent the College of Letters and Science, reflecting the range of disciplines and approaches to teaching across the college. In this episode, we continue with the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic Plus, with Łukasz Wodzyński. In this conversation, we learn about Professor Wodzński's academic journey from computer science to the humanities, learn about several of his innovative assignments, and surface important keys to student engagement in the classroom. Now, here's Molly Harris's conversation with Professor Łukasz Wodzyński.
To get us started, I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself and your role on campus. Could you tell us a little about that?
Of course. So I'm assistant professor of Polish here at UW-Madison at the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic Plus. Polish program at UW-Madison is the oldest such program in North America, so we're very proud of that fact. And Polish studies are a relatively small field, so like most instructors in my position, I'm a bit of a generalist, so teaching everything from Polish language to Polish literature, film, and other forms of culture in between. And in terms of my research, I'm working on a book on adventure, and adventure as a kind of a form of narrative that can play a restorative role in ways our identity and cultural memory are being shaped. So quite exciting.
Yeah, definitely. Well, congratulations on the recent Distinguished Teaching Award. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
It's a great honor and distinction, and also it's very humbling. One of the great things about the nomination process is that it is largely driven by our departmental colleagues, and they are supported by student endorsements, which gives this incredible morale boost and validation of the path we've chosen, the direction we're heading in terms of our teaching, and that's something that I definitely cherish. A lot of innovative teaching, it's a little bit about experiment, and experiments can make us quite vulnerable in a sense of some ideas can be great and students can respond in wonderful ways. Other ideas may not work all that well. So there is always that element of trial and error, which makes the supportive environment so important.
So if you're thinking about yourself today as an educator, and you're thinking back to how you reached this point in your career, are there any experiences or major milestones that stand out or that have shaped the way you think about teaching?
English is my second language. I came to Canada, to the University of Toronto, right after finishing Polish high schools. So figuring out language, but also how to kind of adapt my language, my personality to North American academic setting were part of the challenge. The other thing is that the humanities were not my original program. I come to the study of literature from computer science. So there was also a big deal of reorientation happening there. And I'm also naturally an introvert. Dealing with these three factors and managing insecurities and anxiety and playing the catch-up game in a way throughout my undergraduate and graduate years, those were the big factors shaping how I approach teaching.
And so then how does that end up in your teaching practice today?
I was extremely lucky to have 2 very charismatic instructors as I was transitioning from computer science to academia, who were incredibly erudite. And they also had this incredible scholarly passion, which was very infectious. And so right from the get-go, I had these 2 big role models in terms of how to shape my own approach and my own style. And I think a big component was the various professional development programs I attended throughout my teaching career. Here at UW-Madison, we have the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Mentoring, especially the Madison Teaching and Learning Excellence Program, MTLE, and Course Design and Redesign Institute. Those were fantastic. Not only they provided me with useful tools and strategies for designing and running courses, but also really they help to expand my imagination in terms of showing what is possible and what one can do in a classroom setting. We often tend to be very locked and adhere to the familiar models of teaching. In a way, this is how we were taught and this is how we plan our syllabi and our courses. But I think sometimes in terms of adapting to the changing times, being aware of how the field of education is changing can be very, very helpful and making us more effective as teachers.
Are there any particular things that you're doing in the classroom that you think are really reaching today's student audience?
Yeah, I mean, the general idea behind these changes and introducing these new courses was to focus on engagement and really try to think about the knowledge and skills I like my students to have. And part of it is helping them to navigate this complex minefield that is East Central European cultural history. But the other part of it is also think about what kind of ideas and values and skills and knowledge they can take out of those courses that can be portable, that can be used outside of and beyond the classroom context. So just to provide a concrete example, this semester I teach this course called War and Culture, the Polish Experience, which as a course looks at the Polish historical experience between the two world wars and during the two world wars, and the way that culture mediates that experience. As such, it plays an important part in the program because so much of modern Polish culture revolves around the memory and the experience of war. But at the same time, I want to use that course as an opportunity to think in general about what is war and what role it plays in culture and how it is both paradoxically a source of so many of our historical traumas, but at the same time is seen as the subject of fascination. It's incredibly important for identity formation and also in many ways drives progress. In the course I'm teaching right now, I introduced a series of reflection assignments where the first one asked the students to visit the Wisconsin Veteran Museum and look at the exhibit and the way those exhibits frame the experience of war and try to make connections with the material and the ideas we study in class. And the second one of those reflections is based on this video game called This War of Mine, which is partly based on the siege of Kosovo and partly on some of the author's knowledge of the Warsaw Uprising and other historical events that involve the civilians. And it's primarily focused on the perspective on war from the point of view of civilians and the difficult choices that sometimes entails. And the students are then asked to experience the game a little bit and engage with it, play for a couple of hours, and then just try to reflect on what were some of the choices, how the perspective that the game forces them to take changes their perception of what war might be like, and also how other types of media, including other video games, might present it as. So those are some of the assignments that I'm trying, and typically the results are incredibly rewarding in terms of how much the students get out of those experiences, but also how genuine they feel and how little they feel the need to rely on AI or any other content generating tools because the content comes from within.
So turning to another topic that has been on our minds in LNS and in the Instructional Design Collaborative, do you teach any courses that you would consider large? And are there ways that you approach those courses differently from maybe a smaller seminar or discussion section? Yeah.
There are certain elements of big classes that can be quite helpful. One of them is establishing a shared knowledge base. For any topic-oriented class like adventure, there's usually some kind of ideas and values that we all attach to these topics. And having this sort of large body of students helps to get some of that information and present it in a really striking manner. That also changes from year to year. I'm always amazed of what any group of students has to say, let's say, about war or adventure or any of these other topics. And then trying to get at some of those ideas and values and starting with pair work and then group work and then getting them to the forum of the class and slowly building that more comfortable environment where we can all share ideas, sometimes without necessarily being prompted. Some of the discussion, I create worksheets or little projects that the students can work on that I can then draw on in my own teaching, in a sense of if I, let's say, introduce an activity like one muddy point and one aha moment, where there is one idea that particularly stands out or is particularly influential when it comes to their own thinking and development, as opposed to something in the material that was a little bit muddy or unclear, I can then ask for a couple of volunteers in the class who will gather these points and maybe write me a brief summary. And based on those summaries, my next class can start with just like, okay, here are some of the shaky points. This is something that we need to talk about. Or I noticed that you all were all fascinated with that. I wonder why this is the case. And these are great conversation starters, but also I find they create that sense that I am also learning from them and I am a partner in the conversation rather than somebody who just simply knows. And I think this is one of the simplest ways in which we can foster that culture of dialogue. And also for me as an instructor, as a way of figuring out what the students want to talk about and how they want to take this course. Because, and this is one of the great elements of these courses, is that sometimes the narrative I come in with does not necessarily land with the students. They have a very different idea of what, say, this film or this work of literature is about, and they want to talk about it, and they frame it in a very different way, which again forces me to kind of reevaluate. Maybe this is the more productive way of engaging with it. And I think as instructors, we sometimes have to be, if we have that flexibility, we have to be ready for that and try to respond to it in a way that rewards students and their perspective and in many ways validates it, because this is how we foster that engagement.
So you mentioned that your students are not necessarily Polish majors and they might be coming to courses for a variety of reasons. How do you engage students from those different disciplinary backgrounds or who are coming with different interests?
4 years ago, I taught this course on post-communism and how East Central Europe moved after 1989, moves out of the communist experience. And in the background of that, we have the Russian-Ukrainian war and the full-scale invasion. So I oftentimes find myself having these moments of, let's say, teaching about the Nazi German invasion of Poland in 1939 and then the column of tanks heading towards Kiev on everybody's newsreels. These connections sometimes come out naturally, and sometimes I try to weave them into the classroom material to, again, initiate the conversation about why history and cultural history likes to repeat itself. And my experience of coming into the humanities from a different discipline maybe plays a bit of a role here, in a sense that, again, I'm trying to think of, what is the main takeaway and what can we learn from any given moment or text that is important not just for that particular discipline or bit of cultural history, but can be a much broader lesson. I think one of the things that really helps here is to be aware of that interdisciplinary variety, to think about the different types of experience they bring in and try to make use of that in the class. Let's say in asking them questions about what they make of this material, encouraging them to build on the knowledge they already have, whether it's psychology, sociology, some technical and hard sciences. Students usually have a vast repository of knowledge that they don't realize they have. And so to help them tap into that and show them ways in which they can use that knowledge to connect things and to present their own perspective is one of the great things we can do in our classes as we teach the humanities, because it allows us to integrate all those strands of knowledge. And as such, it plays a big role in not just their development as students of the humanities, but also as citizens. which is why having the more open conversations and having students share that knowledge and to make it visible, let's say, with even simple activities like word clouds and group definitions, shows them how much they already know, but also allows us to see this material from a very different perspective, which is also interesting for the instructor because we sometimes have certain fixed ways of looking at our material, and this kind of openness allows us to see it anew and also change the way we think about it, which can also be inspiring for our students who then see us recognizing the value they bring into this experience and make knowledge out of it.
Yeah, I really love the sort of reciprocity that's happening between instructor and students with each other. And then you can imagine them going then to their other courses and they're bringing what they've talked about in your course then to the other course. They're bringing things from that course into your course.
This is also a great opportunity for us to think and reflect about what it is that we're doing and practicing in the humanities and do reflective work that can help us to get at the fundamentals of what we do. And sometimes this can be incredibly productive because it allows us to reevaluate and shift and think of some of the things that we thought were essential to what we do. And it turns out they're not necessarily so. And I had to recently do a lot of this work because of AI and think of how I can foster engagement and how can I work with my students on reading and viewing and what those things even mean and what do they demand that prior to that we took for granted. But again, these can be very, very productive, and I find as I move from one iteration of the course to the next, I'm putting more emphasis on that reflective element and students taking some ownership of the material. One of the recent things I did with my adventure course, for example, is to introduce a podcast group project. It was an interesting deviation from the standard model of, let's say, a research paper because, in a way, it promotes certain collaboration and task-oriented approach on the student part. But also, when I announced the assignment, I say, like all of my courses are fairly limited in terms of what we can cover in such a short amount of time, but also in terms of my own expertise. So this is your chance to take ownership of this material. And, if you find that there's a flaw with this course, that there is something that you wanted to learn more about or that you didn't see on the syllabus or something that you can explore in more depth, then this is the project to do it. And oftentimes it works great because it ceases to be just a recreative process, but becomes part of their own journey of self-discovery. And when they also examine what they learned in the class, but also where their interests lie and where can they take it for the next stage. The podcast experience to me was a great grading experience. I learned so much from my students, and also you can hear that. And this is one of those things that AI is not as useful, because if AI generates something in a podcast setting, you can tell that there is something that is missing there. Whereas even if it's not scripted, but the students approach the topic with genuine interest and enthusiasm, it really shines. And even if it's unpolished, it just becomes this amazing experience. And listening to that was extremely fulfilling. And some of the feedback I received afterwards was overwhelmingly positive. So I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for those examples. I can definitely see how, as you were saying at the very beginning of this conversation, we have this fixed idea maybe of what education means, and the way that we were taught is how you might expect to then teach the next generation. But I can really see how you've expanded that definition of what does teaching entail and how to reach new generations of students.
One other thing that I find important is that we are also at the center of it. So we have to work to keep ourselves engaged and involved in that process. I look back to one of my early professional development programs when the leading instructor, who was a physicist by training, at one point mentioned, if I'm about to start teaching a course on hydraulics, I think that was his example, and I feel I have no interest and no enthusiasm for it, I'm in trouble. And it stuck with me, and I feel that really big part of that task of engaging the students is trying to find that passion for the material and that interest. Sometimes it comes naturally, sometimes it's a much easier task depending on the topic. Sometimes it's a little bit less tricky, but I feel that this is really where the magic happens, and this is really what the students respond to. And from my perspective, it definitely helped to overcome some of the anxieties and insecurities that I had to deal in my early career. If we are engaged and we're passionate and there is that enthusiasm, everybody feels welcome, everybody feels like they have something to contribute, and they're responding to something that is real and significant and important, and there's great value in that.
This has been the LNS Exchange. For a list of resources and conversation starters, visit our website at idc.ls.wisc.edu. There you'll also find the show notes page for this episode and all the conversations from our previous guests. The Exchange is brought to you by LNS Teaching, Learning, and Academic Planning and produced by the LNS Instructional Design Collaborative. We record this podcast on the UW-Madison campus in Van Hise Hall, which sits atop a ridge overlooking Lake Mendota. It's a beautiful spot and has a deeper significance because everything that resides here rests atop ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejope since time immemorial.